In the autumn of 1857, a photograph was taken in Richmond, Virginia, showing 17 enslaved individuals standing in 3 neat rows outside a tobacco warehouse. For more than a century, this daguerreotype sat filed in a private collection, labeled simply as Property Inventory, H_____estate. But in 1981, when historians at the Virginia Historical Society examined it closely, they noticed something that had gone undetected for 124 years. In the back row, third from the left, a young woman holds her hands in an unusual position, fingers interlaced in a pattern that shouldn't have been possible given the shackles she wore just moments before the image was captured. The discovery of what that hand position meant, and what it revealed about the days following this photograph, would expose a calculated act of resistance so methodical that it took 11 lives before anyone understood what was happening. The records documenting the aftermath were sealed by county authorities and marked not for public review until 1963. What those documents contained would challenge everything we thought we understood about power, patience, and the terrible mathematics of revenge. Before we continue with the story of what happened at H_____estate, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, the ones they try to bury, need to be heard. And in the comments below, tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten histories are reaching. Now, let's discover what that photograph was really documenting. The woman in that photograph was named Judith, and understanding why her hands were positioned that way requires knowing what H_____estate had become by 1857. The estate sprawled across 840 acres of Henrico County bottomland. Its main house was a 3-story Georgian structure overlooking the James River from a manufactured prominence. The property had been in the H_____ family since 1789, passed from father to eldest son through 3 generations, each adding wings and dependencies until it resembled a small village unto itself. By 1857, it housed 43 enslaved people who worked primarily in tobacco cultivation, though the estate also maintained a profitable sideline in what the family called domestic training. Enslaved individuals were hired out to Richmond families as skilled household staff, with H_____ collecting the wages. The master of the estate was Augustus H_____III, 42 years old, a man whose reputation in Richmond society rested on 2 pillars, his eye for profitable tobacco strains and his insistence on what he termed orderly discipline. Unlike some of his neighbors who had begun experimenting with task systems or limited privileges, Augustus maintained rigid control. He kept meticulous records. Each enslaved person had a file in his study documenting their skills, their family relationships, their behavior, and their value. He believed that precision in record-keeping prevented the kinds of management failures he'd witnessed on neighboring properties. Judith had been born at H_____ in 1831, making her 26 years old when the photograph was taken. Her mother had worked in the main house until dying of fever in 1843, after which Judith was trained in the same domestic skills. She learned to read, not uncommon for house slaves who needed to follow written instructions, though this education was supposed to be limited to practical matters. By 1850, she was being hired out to wealthy Richmond families for periods of 6 to 12 months, always returning to H_____ between placements. The wages she earned went directly to Augustus, of course, but these hiring arrangements gave her something else, access to information that field hands never obtained. The other 16 people in the photograph worked various roles at H_____. There was Samuel, the estate's blacksmith, whose skill with metal made him valuable enough that Augustus occasionally allowed him to take outside commissions. There was Rachel, who oversaw the cooking for both the main house and the quarters. There was Moses, who managed the tobacco barns and understood the curing process better than Augustus himself, though he'd never received credit for that expertise. Their faces in the photograph show the blank expressions expected of people being documented as property, no smiles, no obvious emotion, just the stillness required when a photographer needs a long exposure time. What the photograph couldn't capture was the conversation that had taken place 3 days earlier in the quarters, when Judith returned from her latest placement with a Richmond family named Driscoll. She'd been gone 14 months, the longest assignment yet, and she came back with knowledge that would set in motion the events the county would later try to suppress. The autumn of 1857 was heavy with political tension throughout Virginia. The state's economy remained tied to slavery, but debates about the institution's future had grown louder since the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. In Richmond, newspapers ran daily arguments about states' rights, federal overreach, and the mathematical future of slave versus free labor. These debates felt distant to most enslaved people at H______. Their concern was more immediate, focused on the daily calculations of survival under Augustus's systematic control. But Judith had learned something during her time with the Driscoll family, something that made those distant political debates suddenly very relevant to H______ estate. She'd learned it by doing what she'd been trained to do, listening carefully while appearing not to listen at all, reading documents left carelessly visible, and understanding that powerful men often spoke freely in front of people they considered furniture. The photograph was commissioned by Augustus on October 3, 1857. He'd hired a photographer from Richmond named Howard Kellett, who arrived at H_____ that morning with his equipment loaded on a wagon, the camera itself, the glass plates, the chemicals needed for the daguerreotype process, and a portable dark tent for developing. Augustus explained that he wanted a formal documentation of his workforce for insurance purposes. Several estates had recently experienced losses due to fire or disease, and proper documentation of property values had become prudent business practice. The enslaved individuals were assembled in front of the tobacco warehouse around 11 o'clock in the morning when the light was strongest. Augustus arranged them himself, placing the most valuable, those with specialized skills, in the back row where they'd be most prominent. Judith was positioned in that back row, third from the left, between Samuel the blacksmith and Moses, who managed the tobacco barns. What happened next would only become clear years later when someone finally understood the significance of what the photograph had captured. As Kellett prepared his camera, Augustus inspected the group one final time. He wanted them presentable, but not comfortable. This was a property inventory, after all, not a family portrait. He noticed that Judith's hands were clasped in front of her in an odd position, fingers interlaced in a pattern he didn't recognize. He told her to lower her arms to her sides, maintaining the formal posture he wanted documented. Judith complied immediately, dropping her hands to her sides and keeping her expression neutral. Kellett spent several minutes adjusting his camera, checking the light, preparing the glass plate. The exposure would take nearly 30 seconds, during which no one could move without ruining the image. He counted down, removed the lens cap, and began timing the exposure with his pocket watch. During those 30 seconds of forced stillness, a slight wind came up from the river, carrying the scent of cured tobacco from the open warehouse behind them. A few dried leaves skittered across the dirt yard. In the main house, Augustus's wife supervised the preparation of the midday meal, unaware that she was living through the last week of her normal life. In Richmond, 15 miles away, newspapers were being printed that contained articles about slave rebellions in other states, each one increasing the anxiety of white Virginians who saw violence lurking in every shadow. Kellett replaced the lens cap, ending the exposure. He thanked Augustus for his patience and returned to his dark tent to develop the plate. The process took about an hour, during which the assembled enslaved people were dismissed back to their work. Judith returned to the main house where she had afternoon duties in the kitchen. Samuel returned to the blacksmith shop where he was repairing a broken plow blade. Rachel began preparing vegetables for the evening meal. The day continued as any other day at H_____ estate had continued for decades. When Kellett emerged from his dark tent, he showed Augustus the developed daguerreotype. The image was sharp, the faces clear, the composition exactly as Augustus had wanted. He paid Kellett his fee, $3 for the photograph, an additional $1 for the leather case it would be stored in, and Kellett departed for Richmond with his equipment. Augustus placed the photograph in his study, filed it in a drawer with other estate documents, and considered the morning's business concluded. He had no way of knowing that he'd just created the only visual evidence of what would become known in sealed county documents as the H______ incident. He had no way of knowing that Judith's hand position, the one he'd told her to change before the exposure, had been a signal, a confirmation of a conversation that had taken place 3 nights earlier in the quarters. And he had no way of knowing that in the photograph's back row, third from the left, Judith's face showed something that would only become apparent under magnification, the slightest suggestion of satisfaction, as if she knew something that Augustus, for all his meticulous record-keeping, had not managed to document. The first death occurred on October 9th, 6 days after the photograph was taken. Augustus's wife, Margaret, fell suddenly ill during the afternoon. She complained of severe stomach pains and nausea, symptoms that the family doctor summoned from Richmond attributed to contaminated food. By evening, she was vomiting blood. By midnight, she was dead. The doctor recorded the cause as acute gastric distress, origin unknown, a diagnosis broad enough to mean almost anything. The household went into mourning. Augustus, devastated by the loss of his wife of 18 years, retreated to his study for long periods. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by Richmond society and neighboring plantation families. Margaret was buried in the family cemetery, a small plot on a hill overlooking the estate. Life at H_____ was expected to settle back into its patterns once the mourning period ended. But on October 17th, Augustus's 17-year-old daughter, Caroline, developed the same symptoms: stomach pains, nausea, vomiting. The doctor was summoned again, this time bringing a colleague from Richmond who specialized in mysterious illnesses. They examined Caroline thoroughly, consulted their medical texts, and administered treatments that proved useless. Caroline died on October 19th, 10 days after her mother. The doctors were baffled. They noted the similarity of symptoms but could find no common source of contamination. They suggested that perhaps some illness was spreading through the household, though no one else showed any signs. Augustus ordered the entire main house cleaned. Every surface was scrubbed. All food stores were examined, and anything questionable was discarded. Fresh water was brought from a different well. He was taking no chances, not after losing his wife and daughter within 10 days of each other. The household staff, including Judith, who had nursed both Margaret and Caroline during their final illnesses, worked around the clock to ensure the house met Augustus's new standards of cleanliness. On October 24th, Augustus's 15-year-old son, Thomas, fell ill. Same symptoms, same rapid progression. The doctors now admitted they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. They suggested poison, but tests of the food and water revealed nothing. They suggested contagion, but no one else in the household was sick. Thomas died on October 26th. Augustus was now alone except for his elderly mother, who lived in a dependency building and rarely entered the main house. 3 family members dead in 17 days, all from the same mysterious cause. The Richmond newspapers began reporting on the tragedy, speculating about cursed estates and divine punishment, theories that Augustus dismissed as ignorant superstition. He was a rational man. There had to be a rational explanation. He summoned the county sheriff, a man named William Stokes, and demanded an investigation. Stokes arrived at H____ on October 28th with a deputy and began interviewing everyone on the estate. He questioned the household staff extensively, paying particular attention to those who had prepared meals or had access to the family's private spaces. Judith was among those questioned. She answered every question directly, her manner calm and cooperative. She'd been horrified by the deaths, she said. She'd done everything she could to ease their suffering. She couldn't imagine what might have caused such a terrible tragedy. Stokes found nothing suspicious. Everyone's stories aligned. There were no signs of ill will, no evidence of poison, no indication of anything other than a tragic series of deaths from unknown illness. He filed a report stating as much and returned to Richmond, leaving Augustus to grieve alone. But that night in the quarters, something happened that would later be documented in the sealed county files. Samuel the blacksmith fell ill. His symptoms were different, not stomach pains, but a sudden fever and difficulty breathing. He died within hours before anyone could summon a doctor. Rachel, who'd been tending to him, reported his death to the overseer in the morning. The overseer reported it to Augustus, who barely seemed to register the information. What was one enslaved person's death compared to the loss of his entire family? Except it wasn't just Samuel. Over the next 3 weeks, 7 more enslaved people at H____ died. Moses, who managed the tobacco barns, 3 field hands whose names Augustus had barely known, 2 women who worked in the laundry, a teenager who'd been training as a house servant. Their deaths received no newspaper coverage, no investigations, no doctor's consultations. They were property losses documented in Augustus's meticulous records with notations about decreased estate value, but otherwise unremarkable. By November 20, 11 people connected to H____ estate had died in 48 days. 8 of them were enslaved. 3 were Augustus's immediate family. And the only person who'd been present for every single death, who'd nursed the dying family members and lived among the dying enslaved people, was Judith. Sheriff Stokes received an anonymous letter on November 23, 1857. It was delivered to his office in Richmond, written in careful script on plain paper, and it said simply, "Examine the H____ photograph. Look at the third person from the left in the back row. Look at what her hands were doing before she was told to stop." Stokes didn't know what photograph the letter referred to, so he traveled back to H____ estate. He found Augustus in his study, a man who'd aged years and weeks, surrounded by the meticulous records that had once given him such pride. Stokes asked about a photograph, and Augustus remembered the daguerreotype from October 3. He retrieved it from his file drawer and handed it to Stokes. Stokes examined it carefully. 17 people, 3 rows, taken in front of the tobacco warehouse. He identified the third person from the left in the back row, Judith, the house servant who'd been so cooperative during his investigation. Her hands were at her sides, her expression neutral, nothing unusual. He asked Augustus if anything about the photograph stood out, if the photographer had mentioned anything strange. Augustus thought back and remembered only that he told Judith to lower her hands because they'd been positioned oddly. He couldn't recall exactly how they'd been positioned. Stokes kept the photograph and returned to Richmond. He showed it to colleagues, asking if anyone recognized significance in hand positions or gestures. Most shrugged. One older deputy, a man who'd worked slave patrol in his younger years, studied the photograph for a long time before speaking. "You say she changed her hand position before this was taken?" the deputy asked. "That means this isn't what you're looking for. You need to know what she was doing before she changed it." "How would I find that out?" Stokes asked. "You'd need to ask someone who was standing next to her," the deputy said. "Someone who saw what her hands were doing." But therein lay the problem. Of the 17 people in the photograph, 11 were now dead. The 6 survivors were all enslaved people who'd learned long ago that talking to white authorities about other enslaved people was dangerous. Stokes could question them, but would they tell him the truth? Would they know the truth? Would they understand what Judith's hand position had meant? Stokes decided to try a different approach. He researched hand signals and gestures used by enslaved people, a difficult task since such information was rarely documented, and when it was documented, was usually dismissed as primitive communication. He found references to certain patterns being used on the Underground Railroad, signals that meant safety or danger. He found mentions of religious gestures used in secret worship services. But nothing matched what he was looking for. Meanwhile, at H____ estate, Judith continued her duties. She was now the senior house servant, the others having died or been sold off by Augustus, who needed cash to cover his mounting debts. The estate was failing without a family to manage it properly. Augustus spent most of his time in his study, drinking and reviewing his records, trying to find a pattern that would explain his losses. He'd become obsessed with his documentation, convinced that somewhere in his meticulous files was the answer to what had destroyed his household. On December 4th, another enslaved person at H_____ died, a field hand named Jacob. This death was different. Jacob had been healthy the day before, working normally, showing no signs of illness. He died in his sleep, apparently peacefully. When his body was found in the morning, there was a small piece of paper clutched in his hand. It contained 5 words in careful script: "She counted all of us." The overseer found the note and, not understanding its significance, filed it with the property records. He reported Jacob's death to Augustus, who barely acknowledged the information. The estate had lost so much value that individual deaths hardly mattered anymore. Augustus was considering selling the entire property and moving to Richmond, starting over in a city where his family's tragedy wouldn't follow him. But Sheriff Stokes, still investigating, had requested access to all recent documents from H____ estate. The note from Jacob's hand ended up in his pile of papers to review. He read it 3 times, trying to parse its meaning. She counted all of us. Who was she? What did counted mean? Was this referring to the photograph, the inventory that Augustus had commissioned? Stokes returned to H____ on December 10th. This time he didn't announce his visit. He arrived at dawn and went directly to the quarters, where he found Judith preparing to start her day's work. He asked her to walk with him away from the other buildings, down to the river where they couldn't be overheard. "I need you to be truthful with me," Stokes said. "People have died. A lot of people. And I think you know why." Judith looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, not fear, not defiance, just a kind of careful assessment, as if she were deciding something important. "What do you think you know?" she asked. It was a bold question for an enslaved woman to ask a white sheriff. But Stokes let it pass. He was beyond caring about social proprieties. He wanted answers. "I think you had something to do with those deaths," Stokes said. "I think the hand position in that photograph was significant. I think that note from Jacob's hand was about you. I think you counted something or someone, and I need to know what and why." Judith was quiet for a long moment, watching the river. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know what I did when I was hired out to the Driscoll family in Richmond?" she asked. "You were a house servant," Stokes said. "I served at their dinners," Judith said. "Important dinners. Politicians, lawyers, businessmen. They talked about things while I poured their wine and cleared their plates. They talked about Kansas, about whether it would be free or slave. They talked about Virginia's future. And one night they talked about a calculation." "What kind of calculation?" "The mathematics of slavery," Judith said. "How many enslaved people it took to make a plantation profitable, how much each person was worth, how long people lived on average, how many children were born versus how many adults died. They discussed it like it was a problem in arithmetic. One man said that the key to maximizing profit was keeping accurate records, knowing exactly what you owned and what it was worth." He mentioned H____ estate as an example of proper documentation. Stokes felt something cold settling in his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked what I counted," Judith said. "I counted how many people it took to equal the value of Mr. H_____'s family, based on his own records, his own mathematics. His wife was worth 6 of us. His daughter was worth 3. His son was worth 2. Those were his numbers, written in his files. I saw them. He documented our value the same way he documented his tobacco yields." "That doesn't explain the deaths," Stokes said, though he was beginning to suspect it did. When I came back from Richmond, Judith said, I asked a question in the quarters. I asked who wanted to settle an account. 11 people said yes. The 11 who are now dead. Each one agreed to pay one share of Mr. H__________'s debt. Stokes stared at her, understanding crystallizing into horror. You poisoned his family. And then you poisoned the ones who helped you do it. I settled an account, Judith corrected, using his own mathematics. His family equaled 11 of us in value. So 11 of us paid to balance the equation. That's murder, Stokes said. Multiple murders. Is it? Judith asked. Or is it just arithmetic? If 11 of us equal 3 of them, and those 3 are removed, then 11 of us must be removed to maintain the balance. I was simply following the logic of his record-keeping. Stokes grabbed her arm, but she didn't resist. She simply looked at his hand on her arm and then at his face, waiting. How did you do it? He demanded. The doctors found no poison. We tested everything. Arsenic, Judith said calmly. In small doses over time. Mr. H_______ kept it in his supply shed for treating tobacco plants. I had access to the main house, to the food preparation, to everything the family consumed. It was easy to administer to them. And then, after they died, it was easy to administer to the 11 who'd agreed to help me. They knew what they were accepting. They understood the price of settling the account. They agreed to be poisoned. Stokes was incredulous. They agreed to die. We were always going to die, Judith said quietly. On this estate or another. Worked until we couldn't work anymore, valued only for what we could produce. At least this way, our deaths had meaning. At least this way, we proved that his system could be turned against him. They agreed that 11 of us equaled 3 of them, Judith said. They agreed that if we removed 3 of them, 11 of us would have to be removed to maintain Mr. H________'s cherished balance. They chose to be the 11. Each of them saw it as an act of defiance, a way to destroy his household while following his own logic. He valued us at certain amounts. We simply made those valuations real. Stokes felt sick. The cold logic of it, the calculated revenge disguised as mathematical precision, was beyond anything he'd encountered. The hand position in the photograph. What did it mean? Confirmation, Judith said. I arranged it with them 3 nights before the photograph. If 11 agreed to the full plan, both parts, the killing and the dying, I would hold my hands in a specific pattern, a pattern that meant the account was settled, the numbers balanced. 10 of them saw it before Mr. H______ told me to lower my hands. The 11th, Samuel, knew about it even though he couldn't see it from where he stood. That photograph was documentation of an agreement, Sheriff. The same kind of documentation Mr. H______ valued so much. Why are you telling me this? Stokes asked. You know I have to arrest you. Because the account isn't settled yet, Judith said. And for the first time, Stokes saw something dangerous in her expression. 11 of us paid, but the equation still doesn't balance. Mr. H______ has lost his family, yes. But he's still alive. And according to his own records, his personal value exceeds all of ours combined. So the account remains open. Stokes realized what she was saying. You're planning to kill him too. I'm planning to complete the mathematics, Judith said. He documented our lives as numbers. I'm simply proving that numbers have consequences. When you reduce people to value calculations, you shouldn't be surprised when someone settles the accounts. Just when Stokes thought he understood the full scope of the horror at H______ estate, Judith's words revealed something worse. The killing wasn't finished. The terrible mathematics she'd created still demanded one final subtraction. He tightened his grip on her arm and began pulling her toward his horse. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when Sheriff Stokes tried to stop what Judith had set in motion. Stokes was 50 feet from his horse when Judith spoke again. "You should know," she said calmly, "that Mr. H_____ had his coffee this morning. The same coffee I've prepared for him every morning since his family died. The same coffee I prepared today before you arrived." Stokes stopped walking. He turned to look at her, and she met his gaze without flinching. "How much did you give him?" he asked. "Enough," Judith said. "The dose I've been giving him for weeks now. Small amounts accumulating in his system. By my calculations, based on the rate his family deteriorated, he has perhaps 3 hours before the symptoms become severe, perhaps 5 hours before the damage is irreversible, perhaps 8 hours before he dies." Stokes made a decision. He dragged Judith back toward the main house, shouting for the overseer. When the men appeared, Stokes ordered him to restrain Judith and lock her in one of the estate storage buildings. Then he ran to the main house, where he found Augustus in his study, pale and sweating, complaining about stomach discomfort. "We need to get you to Richmond," Stokes said. "Now. You've been poisoned." Augustus looked at him with unfocused eyes. "Poisoned? By who?" "Your house servant, Judith. The same person who poisoned your family. We need to move immediately." But Augustus couldn't stand without assistance. The poison had been accumulating in his system for too long. Stokes got him onto a horse, and they rode for Richmond as fast as Augustus's condition allowed, which was far slower than Stokes wanted. Every mile, Augustus grew weaker. By the time they reached a Richmond doctor's office, Augustus was barely conscious. The doctor examined him, listened to Stokes's explanation, and shook his head. "If it's arsenic poisoning and he's been receiving doses for weeks, there's nothing I can do. The damage is already done. His organs are failing. I can make him comfortable, but I cannot save him." Augustus H____3 died at 4 o'clock that afternoon, December 10, 1857. He was the 12th person connected to H_____ estate to die in 68 days. His death made Judith's arithmetic complete. 11 enslaved people plus 1 master equaled the cost of 3 family members, calculated using Augustus's own valuation system. Stokes returned to H_____ estate that evening. He found the overseer standing guard outside the storage building where Judith was locked, and he could hear her voice through the door. She was singing something, a melody Stokes didn't recognize, her voice steady and clear. He had the overseer open the door. Judith stood in the center of the small room, her hands clasped in front of her in that same pattern she'd held them in before the photograph, fingers interlaced in a way that looked deliberately meaningful. She stopped singing when Stokes entered. "He's dead," Stokes said. "I know," Judith replied. "I calculated the timing carefully. It was important that the numbers balance exactly." "Why?" Stokes asked. "Why all of this? You could have run. You could have escaped on the Underground Railroad." "Run where?" Judith interrupted. "To another place where my value would be calculated and documented. To another state where I'd be someone's property. Running doesn't change the system, Sheriff. It just moves you within it." "So instead you committed murder," Stokes said. "Multiple murders. You killed his entire family and 11 of your own people." "I used his mathematics," Judith corrected again. "Every death was justified by his own records, his own calculations of worth. I simply proved that when you reduce human lives to numbers, those numbers can be manipulated." He thought his meticulous record-keeping gave him control. "I showed him that records work both ways. They can document value, but they can also document debts. And debts must be paid. Stokes sat down on a barrel, suddenly exhausted. The 11 who helped you, they really agreed to die. They understood what we were doing, Judith said. Each of them had lost someone, sold away, worked to death, punished until they broke. Each of them had been reduced to a number in Mr. H______S files. They saw the opportunity to prove that those numbers had power. They chose to become part of an equation that would destroy everything Augustus H______ built, but at the cost of their own lives. They were always going to die, Judith said quietly. On this estate or another. Worked until we couldn't work anymore, valued only for what we could produce. At least this way, our deaths had meaning. At least this way, we proved that his system could be turned against him. Stokes reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, one of Augustus's record books that he'd taken from the study. He opened it to a page marked with a ribbon and held it toward Judith. I found this while going through his papers. I want you to explain it to me. Judith took the ledger and examined the page. It showed a detailed accounting from 1851, listing enslaved individuals by name with monetary values beside each. Her own name appeared halfway down, Judith, female, age 20, house-trained, literate for practical purposes, worth $200. Below that were notes about her mother, deceased 1843, loss recorded at $800. He valued my mother at $800, Judith said, her voice flat. Less than he paid for a good horse. And when she died from fever she caught because he refused to let her rest when she was sick, he recorded it as a financial loss. Not as a person dying, not as a daughter losing her mother. As $800 subtracted from his assets. And you remembered that, Stokes said. I remembered all of it, Judith replied. She turned pages in the ledger, pointing to other entries. Samuel was valued at $900 because of his blacksmith skills. Moses at $700 because he understood tobacco curing. Rachel at $600 because she could manage a kitchen. We had names, Sheriff. We had skills and relationships and lives. But in his records, we were just numbers that either added to or subtracted from his wealth. She closed the ledger and handed it back to Stokes. When I was in Richmond, serving at those dinners, I heard them discuss the peculiar institution, as if it were a science. They had theories about optimal ratios of workers to acres, calculations for maximum productivity, projections for birth rates and mortality rates. They talked about us the way a merchant talks about inventory. And Mr. H______S name came up because he was so precise in his documentation. They admired him for it. They said he understood the mathematics of slavery better than almost anyone in Virginia. So you decided to teach him a different kind of mathematics, Stokes said. I decided to complete his equation, Judith corrected. He created the values. He established that his wife equaled 6 of us, that his children had specific numerical worth compared to ours. I didn't invent that arithmetic. I just solved for the variable he'd left undefined, what happens when the numbers are balanced through subtraction instead of accumulation. Stokes stood and began pacing the small room. Tell me about the 11. I need to understand how this actually worked. How you convinced them, how they agreed to die. Judith was quiet for a moment, then began speaking in a lower voice. 3 nights after I returned from Richmond, I gathered people I trusted in the quarters. Not everyone, only those I knew had suffered most under Mr. H______S system. I told them what I'd heard in Richmond about how we were discussed as mathematical problems. I showed them copies I'd made of Mr. H______S valuation records. I'd learned to copy his handwriting well enough that I could reproduce his ledgers when I needed information. You copied his records? Stokes was surprised. For years, Judith said. Whenever I was assigned to clean his study, I would memorize pages and reproduce them later. I wanted to understand exactly how he saw us, what calculations he was making about our lives. Knowledge is power, even for the powerless. Especially for the powerless. She continued, when I showed them his calculations, when I explained that his family's total value equaled exactly 11 of us according to his own mathematics, something changed in that room. Samuel spoke first. He said his wife had been sold away 5 years earlier to cover Mr. H________'s gambling debts. He'd never seen her again. He asked if there was a way to make Mr. H______ understand what that loss felt like. And you told him there was, Stokes said. I told him the truth, Judith replied. I told him that if we removed Mr. H______'s family using his own valuation system, we could prove that his numbers had real consequences. But I also told him the second part, that to complete the equation, to make the mathematics irrefutable, 11 of us would have to be removed as well. The account had to balance exactly. And Samuel agreed to that. To being poisoned after helping you poison the H______ family. He was the first to agree, Judith said. He said he'd rather die with meaning than live as a number in Mr. H_______'s ledger. Then Moses agreed. Then Rachel. One by one, all 11 agreed. They understood both parts of the plan. They understood they would die, and they chose it anyway because it was the only choice they'd ever been given that actually meant something. Stokes felt a chill run through him. How did you administer the poison to them after the H______ family was dead? How did you convince them to actually accept it? I didn't have to convince them, Judith said. We had an agreement. After Mr. H______'s wife died, Samuel came to me and asked when his turn would be. I told him soon. After the daughter died, Moses asked the same question. They were ready. They'd made peace with it. I prepared food for them, the same as I'd prepared food for the H______ family, and they ate it knowing what it contained. Each of them died understanding that their death completed part of the equation. That's insane, Stokes said. That's mass murder and mass suicide combined. That's mathematics, Judith replied calmly. Mr. H______ created a system where human lives had precise numerical values. I simply demonstrated what happens when you take that system to its logical conclusion. If 3 of them equal 11 of us, then removing 3 of them requires removing 11 of us to maintain balance. It's not insane, Sheriff. It's arithmetic. Stokes pulled out the photograph again, the daguerreotype from October 3rd. He studied the faces of the 17 people in the image. These 11 who agreed to die, they're all in this photograph. You arranged that, didn't you? You made sure they were all documented before it began. Yes, Judith said. I wanted evidence that they existed, that they had faces and names before they became subtractions in the equation. Mr. H______ commissioned that photograph to document his property for insurance purposes. I made sure it documented the people who would destroy his property from within. And the hand position, Stokes said. Show me again what it meant. Judith interlaced her fingers in the complex pattern she'd shown him before. It's a symbol that means, the count is complete. We developed it years ago as a way to communicate information that couldn't be spoken aloud. When hired-out workers like me would return from other estates, we'd use signals like this to convey important information. How many people were being sold, how many had died, whether a place was safe or dangerous. It was our own record-keeping system, parallel to the white man's ledgers, but invisible to them. And when you held your hands like this in the photograph, Stokes said, the other 10 people standing near you understood what it meant. They understood that all 11 had agreed, Judith confirmed. That the plan was confirmed. That the mathematics would be completed. Mr. H______ saw my hands and thought nothing of it, just an unusual posture. But for the 10 who were close enough to see clearly, it was confirmation of a pact. Samuel couldn't see it from his position, but Moses told him afterward. The 11th person, our final calculation, had confirmed the equation. Stokes sat back down, feeling the weight of what he was hearing. Did any of them have regrets? In their final moments, did any of them wish they could take it back? Jacob did, Judith said quietly. He was the last to die. And in his final hours, he asked me if there was meaning in what we'd done. I told him yes. I told him that every time someone looked at Mr. H_______'s meticulous records and saw that 11 enslaved people had died in the same time period as his family, people would have to ask why. They'd have to confront the numbers. They'd have to see the equation. Is that why he left the note? Stokes asked. The one that said, she counted all of us. He wanted to make sure someone would eventually understand it wasn't random, Judith said. He wanted evidence that this was calculated, deliberate, mathematical. He knew the note might not be understood immediately, but he trusted that someday someone would look at all the pieces, the photograph, the deaths, the timing, and recognize the pattern. I recognize it now, Stokes said. And I have to arrest you. You know that. I've known that since the moment I decided to complete the equation, Judith said. Arrest, trial, execution, those are just the final calculations. The mathematics is already complete. Was it worth it? Stokes asked. And this time he really wanted to know the answer. Judith looked at him directly. Mr. H______ spent decades reducing us to numbers. He believed his meticulous documentation gave him power, that his calculations made him sophisticated. But he never understood what those numbers really meant. He never had to live as a number. He never had to watch his mother die and see her recorded as an $800 loss. He never had to know his own value could be calculated and compared to livestock. She paused, then continued. I showed him what his numbers meant. I proved that if you create a system where human worth can be mathematically calculated, then those calculations can be used to destroy you. Every plantation owner in Virginia who reads about this case, who learns about the mathematics I used, will have to look at their own ledgers differently. They'll have to wonder if their enslaved people are also keeping count, if their arithmetic might also be turned into equations of revenge. That uncertainty, that fear. Yes, Sheriff. It was worth it. Stokes stood slowly. He'd come to H______ estate expecting a simple murder case. But what he'd found was something more complex and more disturbing than he'd imagined. He looked at Judith, this woman who'd learned to read in order to serve white families better, who'd used that literacy to copy her master's records and turn his own mathematics against him, who convinced 10 other people to die as part of a calculated act of revenge disguised as arithmetic. One more question, he said. If you could go back to that night when you gathered the 11, if you could make a different choice, would you? Judith considered this carefully. No, she said finally. Because the alternative was to continue being a number in someone else's ledger, to live and die as property valued only for what I could produce. The 11 people who died with me chose the same thing. They chose to be part of an equation that mattered. Even if that equation ended in death, we were going to die anyway, Sheriff. At least this way, we died proving that Mr. H______'s cherished numbers had consequences he never imagined. Judith was arrested on December 10, 1857. She was charged with 12 counts of murder, Margaret, Caroline, Thomas, Augustus H______, and 8 of the enslaved people who died at the estate. The 3 other enslaved deaths weren't included in the charges because no one could prove definitively that they weren't from natural causes, though Stokes suspected otherwise. The case immediately attracted attention in Richmond. Word spread quickly about an enslaved woman who'd poisoned her master's entire family and then poisoned the people who'd helped her do it, all as part of what she called settling accounts. The details were sensational enough that newspapers from as far as Charleston and Baltimore sent correspondents to cover the trial. Stokes spent the weeks before the trial investigating further, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened at H____estate. He interviewed the 6 surviving enslaved people who'd been in the photograph, but they claimed to know nothing about Judith's plans. They said they'd never understood what her hand position meant, that they'd simply been standing where Mr. H_____ told them to stand for the photograph. Stokes didn't believe them, but he also couldn't prove they were lying. He also examined Augustus H_____'s records more carefully. What he found disturbed him more than he'd expected. Augustus had indeed maintained meticulous documentation of every enslaved person at the estate. Not just their names and values, but detailed notes about their personalities, their relationships, their strengths and weaknesses. He documented which enslaved people were compliant and which showed signs of resistance. He'd calculated how many years of labor he could expect from each person based on their age and health. He'd even made projections about the future children of enslaved women, calculating their potential value before they were born. One entry in particular stayed with Stokes. In Augustus's 1851 ledger, there was a note about Judith: exceptional memory and observational skills, learns quickly. Could be problematic if not properly managed, but valuable for complex household tasks. Worth training despite risk. Augustus had recognized Judith's intelligence, had even acknowledged it might be dangerous, but had decided to exploit it anyway because it increased her value. He'd created the weapon that would eventually destroy him, and he documented the process in his own handwriting. Stokes also discovered something else in Augustus's papers: correspondence with other plantation owners about security measures. These letters discuss strategies for preventing slave rebellions, including recommendations to avoid teaching enslaved people to read, to separate family members to prevent organizing, and to maintain detailed surveillance of any enslaved person who showed unusual intelligence. Augustus had received these warnings but had ignored them when it came to Judith because her skills made her so profitable when hired out to Richmond families. The trial began on January 14, 1858, in Richmond. The courtroom was packed with spectators, plantation owners who wanted to see justice done, abolitionists who saw Judith's case as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence, curious citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the crimes, and journalists scribbling notes for their newspapers. The prosecution was led by Walter Thornton, a prominent Richmond attorney who'd built his reputation on securing convictions in difficult cases. He presented the evidence methodically: Judith's detailed confession to Sheriff Stokes, the pattern of deaths at H_____estate, the medical evidence of arsenic poisoning in Augustus H______'s body, and testimony from the estate's overseer about Judith's access to the family's food and supplies. Thornton also brought in an expert, a professor of chemistry from the Medical College of Virginia, who explained how arsenic poisoning worked, how small doses could accumulate in the body over time, and how the symptoms matched those observed in the H_____ family. The professor estimated that Judith had been administering poison to Augustus for at least 6 weeks before his death, possibly longer. But Thornton's most powerful evidence was Judith herself. He called her to testify, believing that putting her on the stand would expose her as the cold-blooded killer he was portraying. He questioned her about each death, asking her to describe how she'd administered the poison, when she'd decided to kill each person, how she'd felt watching them die. Judith answered every question calmly and precisely. She explained that she'd taken arsenic from Augustus's supply shed, where it was stored for treating tobacco plants. She described mixing it into food and beverages in quantities small enough to avoid immediate detection. She detailed the timeline of each poisoning with the same meticulous precision Augustus had used in his record-keeping. And she never showed remorse. "Did you feel any guilt when Mrs. H_____ died?" Thornton asked. "I felt satisfaction," Judith replied. "She was valued at 6 times what Samuel was worth. Her death meant 6 of us could be accounted for in the equation. And when young Caroline died, she was only 17 years old. Did you feel nothing?" "Caroline was valued at 3 times what Rachel was worth," Judith said. I felt that the mathematics was progressing as calculated. The courtroom erupted at this response. Judge Harrison Caldwell had to use his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Plantation owners in the gallery looked at each other with expressions of horror and rage. This was exactly what they feared, an enslaved person who'd learned to think, to calculate, to plan, and who'd used those skills to deadly effect. But something unexpected happened during Thornton's cross-examination. When he asked Judith to explain why she'd poisoned the 11 enslaved people who'd helped her, her answer gave him pause. They volunteered, Judith said. Each of them understood both parts of the plan. They knew they would help remove the H____ family, and they knew they would themselves be removed to complete the equation. They chose this. It was the only meaningful choice they'd ever been given. You're saying they wanted to die? Thornton asked skeptically. I'm saying they wanted their deaths to mean something, Judith replied. We were going to die eventually anyway. Worked to death, sold away from our families, used up and discarded. At least this way, our deaths proved a point. They proved that Mr. H______'s mathematics had consequences. What point? Thornton demanded. What possible point justifies 12 murders? Judith looked directly at the jury, 12 white men, several of them plantation owners themselves. The point that if you reduce human beings to numbers, those numbers can be manipulated. The point that meticulous record-keeping works both ways. The point that when you create a system where human worth is calculated in dollars and cents, you shouldn't be surprised when someone uses those calculations to settle accounts. The defense attorney was a court-appointed lawyer named Benjamin Porter, who'd been practicing law for less than 5 years. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly uncomfortable with the case he'd been assigned. His strategy was to argue that Judith's confession had been coerced, that Sheriff Stokes had threatened or manipulated her into admitting to crimes she hadn't committed. He called Stokes to testify. Sheriff, when you questioned the defendant on December 10th, did you use any form of physical intimidation? No, Stokes replied. Did you threaten her in any way? No. Did you promise her anything in exchange for her confession? No. She confessed voluntarily. She wanted me to understand what she'd done. Porter tried a different approach. Sheriff, you've examined Augustus H______'s records extensively. Is it true that he maintained detailed valuations of enslaved people? Yes. And is it true that these valuations treated human beings as property with specific monetary worth? Yes. And the defendant was exposed to these valuations? Yes. She copied many of his records over the years. Porter turned to the jury. Gentlemen, what we have here is not a woman acting of her own free will, but a woman whose mind was corrupted by constant exposure to a system that dehumanized her and everyone she knew. She was taught by Mr. H_____ himself to see people as numbers. Can we truly hold her responsible for taking that lesson to its logical conclusion? It was a creative argument, but it fell flat with the jury. The idea that slavery itself had driven Judith to murder was too dangerous a concept for white Virginians to accept. If they acknowledged that reducing people to property values could provoke this kind of calculated revenge, they'd have to confront the validity of the entire system. That was unthinkable. On January 17, 1858, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury found Judith guilty on all 12 counts of murder. Judge Caldwell sentenced her to hang on February 3. As he pronounced the sentence, he added a statement that would be quoted in newspapers throughout the South: the defendant's crimes are particularly heinous, not simply because of the number of deaths, but because they represent a calculated rebellion against the natural order. This court cannot and will not tolerate such actions. But even as Judith's fate was sealed, something was happening behind the scenes that would shape how her story was remembered, or rather, how it would be forgotten. Several prominent Richmond families who'd employed Judith as hired help began visiting the county prosecutor's office. These families were concerned about what Judith might reveal if given a public platform at her execution. Thomas Whitfield, who'd hired Judith for 9 months in 1853, met privately with the prosecutor. "That woman spent time in my household," he said. "She served at private dinners where sensitive matters were discussed, political matters, business matters. If she's given a public execution, if she's allowed to speak from the gallows, there's no telling what she might reveal." "She'd be lying," the prosecutor replied, "trying to cause chaos." "Perhaps," Whitfield said. "But lies can be damaging even when they're false. And some things she overheard, well, they might not be lies. I'm not saying she's right about anything, but I am saying that a public execution would be unnecessarily risky." Similar conversations happened with other families. The Driscolls, who'd employed Judith most recently and in whose parlor she'd learned about the mathematics of slavery, were particularly concerned. James Driscoll made a donation to the county prosecutor's re-election campaign and suggested that perhaps the H_____ case would be better handled quietly, without unnecessary publicity. On January 28, Sheriff Stokes received new orders from the county prosecutor. All records related to the H____ case were to be sealed and marked, not for public review. The official justification was to protect the dignity of the H____ family and prevent their tragedy from becoming permanent public spectacle. The execution would be moved from the public gallows in Richmond to a private hanging at the county jail, with only required witnesses present. Stokes understood what was really happening. The case had become too dangerous. Judith's methodology, her use of Augustus's own mathematical system against him, was too threatening to the established order. If her story spread, if enslaved people throughout Virginia heard about a woman who'd studied her master's records and turned them into weapons, the potential for copycat actions was enormous. Better to let her die quietly and let the story fade. In the days leading up to the execution, Stokes visited Judith in her cell several times. He wasn't sure why he kept going back. Perhaps he hoped she'd show remorse or fear or something human that would make her easier to understand. But she never did. She remained calm, spending her time writing. The jailer had provided her with paper and ink at Stokes's request, though no one told her why. Stokes wanted documentation of her perspective, even if those documents would be immediately sealed. On February 2, the day before the execution, Stokes asked her what she was writing. "A full accounting," Judith said. "Every detail of the plan, from the moment I first heard about Mr. H______'s valuations being discussed in Richmond to the final dose of poison I gave him. I want there to be a record that explains the mathematics completely, even if no one reads it for 100 years. "Why?" Stokes asked. "You're going to die tomorrow. Why does it matter if anyone understands?" "Because mathematics is universal," Judith replied. "The calculations I used weren't just about H_____ estate. They apply to every plantation, every enslaved person who's been reduced to a number. Someday, when this system finally ends, and it will end, Sheriff, one way or another, people will need to understand what it really meant, what it did to people, how it created the conditions for actions like mine. This document will be part of that understanding." She handed Stokes the pages she'd completed, over 30 sheets covered in neat handwriting. He read portions of it and found it disturbing in its precision. She documented not just the murders, but the entire philosophy behind them, the mathematical logic that had guided every decision. She'd included Augustus's actual valuation formulas, showing exactly how she'd calculated that 11 enslaved people equaled his family. She'd even included suggestions for how her methodology could be applied in other circumstances. Not as advocacy, she insisted, but as demonstration of how a dehumanizing system could be systematically destroyed from within. "This is essentially a manual for slave rebellion disguised as a confession," Stokes said. "This is a demonstration that record-keeping works both ways," Judith corrected. Mr. H______'s pride was his meticulous documentation. "Mine is too." The difference is that I'm documenting resistance instead of oppression. On the morning of February 3, 1858, Stokes accompanied Judith from her cell to the jail yard where the gallows had been erected. Only 5 other people were present: the hangman, the county prosecutor, 2 deputies, and Reverend Samuel Morrison, who'd been allowed to spend the previous evening with Judith. The Reverend Morrison had reported to the prosecutor that Judith remained unrepentant. "I offered her the chance to confess her sins and seek forgiveness," he'd said. "She told me she had nothing to confess because she'd simply completed an equation." She treated the whole conversation as if we were discussing mathematics rather than murder. It was deeply unsettling. As they walked to the gallows, Judith showed no signs of fear. Her hands were bound, but she walked steadily, her head up. The morning was cold, with frost on the ground and their breath visible in the air. The gallows creaked slightly in the wind. Before the hood was placed over her head, the prosecutor asked if she had any final words. It was a formality. In a private execution, final words had no audience beyond those required to witness the hanging. But the law required the question to be asked. Judith looked at each person present, her gaze settling finally on Stokes. "Augustus H_____ taught me that careful record-keeping was the foundation of power. I kept careful records, too. 11 + 1 = 12. The accounts are balanced. And to anyone who reads the documentation I've left behind, remember that every system built on dehumanization contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. You just have to understand the mathematics." Then the hood was placed over her head. The noose tightened around her neck. And at 7 o'clock on the morning of February 3, 1858, Judith was hanged. Her body was cut down after 30 minutes and buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. The prosecutor collected all of her written documents, the full accounting she'd prepared, and added them to the sealed files. The sealed records were filed in the county archives with strict instructions, not for public review. Sensitive material regarding security concerns. They would remain sealed for 105 years. H_____ estate was sold at auction on March 12, 1858. The bidding was subdued. The property's reputation as a place of death had made potential buyers wary. It eventually sold to a Richmond merchant named Lawrence Hastings, who had no prior experience in plantation agriculture and no interest in continuing tobacco cultivation. He kept 3 of the surviving enslaved people to maintain the property and sold the others to plantations in southern Virginia. Hastings made immediate changes to the estate. He tore down the main house in the spring of 1860, claiming it had a troubled atmosphere that made him uncomfortable. He built a smaller, more modest residence on a different part of the property, facing away from the James River. The tobacco warehouses were converted to storage for his mercantile business. The quarters where enslaved people had lived were emptied and eventually collapsed from neglect. The Civil War came to Virginia in 1861, and H_____ estate found itself near several battle lines. The property was used briefly as a staging area for Confederate troops, then later occupied by Union forces. By the war's end in 1865, much of the estate had been damaged or destroyed. The remaining enslaved people were freed, and most left the property immediately, seeking lives elsewhere. In the decades that followed, the estate changed hands several more times. By 1900, it had been subdivided and sold to multiple owners. The land that had once been Augustus H______'s pride became suburban lots, small farms, and eventually, in the mid-20th century, residential neighborhoods. The original boundaries of the estate became impossible to trace. The photograph remained in the county archives, filed with the sealed H_____ records. For over a century, it sat in darkness, carefully preserved but never examined, marked only with its original label, Property Inventory, H_____ estate, October 3, 1857. The 17 faces in that photograph, 3 neat rows of people arranged by their perceived value, remained anonymous and unidentified for 124 years. In 1963, the sealed county files were finally opened to researchers as part of a broader effort to make historical records more accessible. A graduate student named Patricia Chen was researching domestic life on Virginia plantations when she discovered the H_____ file. What she found inside: the trial transcripts, Judith's written confession, Augustus's valuation records, Sheriff Stokes's reflective letter, and most importantly, the photograph, became the foundation for her doctoral dissertation. Chen spent years piecing together the full story. She tracked down descendants of people who'd been at H____ estate, interviewed elderly residents who remembered family stories about the place, and consulted experts on enslaved resistance strategies. Her work was meticulous, and when she finally published her findings in 1981, the photograph was included with full context and identification of as many people as she could document. The image appeared in her academic paper with a detailed caption: Daguerreotype of enslaved individuals at H____ estate, Henrico County, Virginia, October 3, 1857. Taken 6 days before a series of deaths that would result in the estate's collapse and the execution of Judith, back row, third from left, who confessed to systematic poisoning using methodologies derived from the master's own valuation records. Notable for documented use of hand signals as resistance communication. Chen's paper generated scholarly interest but never reached mainstream awareness. The story was too complex, too disturbing, too challenging to existing narratives about slavery and resistance. Academic journals published responses and critiques, but the broader public remained largely unaware of what had happened at H____ estate. The photograph itself was eventually donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where it remains in their collection today. It's occasionally displayed in exhibits about slavery in Virginia, always with extensive contextual information. Visitors who see it often study the faces, trying to find evidence of what those people knew, what they'd agreed to, what they were thinking as they stood in those 3 neat rows. The exact meaning of Judith's hand position was never definitively decoded, despite Chen's extensive research and consultation with experts on slave communication systems. Without other examples to compare it to, and with all the people who might have understood it dead by early 1858, the truth remained locked in that brief moment captured by Howard Kellett's camera. What historians know for certain is this: 11 enslaved people and 1 master died as part of a calculated act that used the master's own valuation system against him. 12 deaths to balance an equation that Augustus H____ had created through years of meticulous record-keeping that reduced human beings to property values. Whether this was justice, murder, resistance, or something that transcended simple categorization remains debated by scholars who study the period. Sheriff Stokes's 1871 letter, found in the sealed files, provided the most haunting perspective on the case. Written 13 years after Judith's execution when he was in his 60s and reflecting on his career, Stokes tried to articulate his conflicted feelings about what had happened. I enforced the law. I arrested the guilty party, secured a conviction, witnessed the execution. By every legal standard, I did my duty. But I cannot say with certainty that justice was served. When a society creates a system that calculates human worth in dollars and cents, that documents people as property with precise valuations, it should not be surprised when someone uses those calculations to devastating effect. Judith killed 12 people, and for that she was rightly punished by the laws of Virginia. But those 12 deaths occurred within a system that had already killed thousands through its daily operations, working people to death, separating families, reducing human souls to numbers in ledgers. Her crime was individual and prosecutable. The greater crime was legal and protected by the full force of our government and society. I have examined Augustus H_____'s records many times since that terrible autumn. I have seen how he valued human beings with the same precision he used for his tobacco yields and his livestock holdings. I have read his notes about people's personalities and relationships, written not out of interest in them as humans, but as assessments of their productivity and potential resistance. And I understand, though I wish I did not, exactly how Judith came to see those records as justification for her actions. She once told me that she'd learned in Richmond parlors that slavery was discussed as a mathematical problem by educated men who admired Augustus's record-keeping. She said they talked about optimal ratios and productivity calculations and birth rate projections, all while she poured their wine and cleared their plates. She said she realized then that if they could reduce her life to mathematics, she could use mathematics to respond. I do not know how to reconcile these truths. I do not know how to hold both realities in my mind, that Judith was a murderer who deserved punishment, and that she was created by a system that had been murdering people legally for generations. I suspect I will die without resolving this conflict. Perhaps it cannot be resolved. Perhaps some truths are too contradictory to coexist peacefully in one mind. I keep the photograph on my desk, the one taken 6 days before it all began. I look at those 17 faces and wonder what they knew, what they felt, what calculations they were making about their own lives and values. And I wonder if 100 years from now, people will look at that photograph and understand what it really documented, not property inventory as Augustus intended, but a moment of agreement among people who decided that dying with meaning was better than living as numbers in someone else's ledger. This mystery shows us that the most devastating acts of resistance sometimes operate within the very logic of the systems they oppose, using the oppressor's own mathematics to prove their inhumanity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Judith's actions were justified by Augustus H______'s dehumanizing calculations? Or was this simply a series of murders that should be condemned regardless of context? Could there ever be such a thing as justified revenge when human beings are treated as property? Leave your comment below. I want to hear your perspective on this complex and disturbing piece of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates the difficult truths hidden in forgotten photographs. See you in the next video.